So I don't need to introduce Ali. Everybody in this room knows him, has already worked with him in co-designing ideas and proposals. I will just say he is a professor of solar earth sciences, Cambridge University. He's been to many universities across the Western world. Obviously, in the UK, Imperial and Cambridge. In the US, in the Americas, Toronto University, then MIT, then do I miss some?
No, I just needed a job and
Yeah. I just want to say that he's one of those people that listens and then creates in the most creative way synergies and ideas. And he's also one of these rare creatures that do fundamental research, but also cares about impact. So I think there is a lot of value and beauty in that, and that's why I'm really happy that we work together. So Ali, you have the floor, and at least 1 hour to introduce us to your world.
thank you. So that is me, just so you know. So thanks for having me. And how much time do I have? You said an hour.
Yes, but you
people
can allow some interaction in that hour. You decide where you allow interaction while you speak or at the end of your talk.
Okay, so feel free to interrupt if something's not clear, or if something's interesting and you want to learn. We don't have to finish my presentation. It's quite modular. So if I make a few points that is interesting and we move on. With great, just key points that, so we have a lab which is called Modeling Ocean Dynamics and Ecosystems Lab, and that's the department. And we use observations, computing, and AI. And I would say the strength of the lab is in putting different types of observations together to answer questions. So we are very much question-driven, and then we tend to work with people like Nick that can go find whatever is needed to make something happen. And so I will show results. Wow. What did I do? Okay, so this is our group. So 20 people, 12 different countries, and those are the sort of research topics. And we are expanding, but we are reshaping into more of a formal lab. And so we are hiring a communication director and admin, and assigning 2 co-directors, and Nick will be one of them. And that's why there's so many arrows that go to Nick. And so he will be the director of operations, and then Raf will be the director of science. So this is more of the science part. That's more of a, real world, if you like, thing. And it just happens like all of us that AI is now in everything. So I just put it there at the center. And these are our funders, and those are institutions that we have like significant collaborations with. So many arrows actually go to them. So things that I show, these people did it. I didn't. So I'm going to use the we. We're going to talk about ocean circulation. This would be a video, but now this is a PDF. So imagine this turning and showing arrows and the deep ocean circulation. But I'll show many plots about the ocean circulation, the depth of the ocean. Let's just remember that from pole to pole is 10,000 kilometers, and the full depth of the ocean is just a few kilometers, right? So I'll show things that make you think that you're talking about a bathtub, but we don't. It's really, really a 2D thing. But that very slight depth makes a big difference, as we know. So why we care about ocean circulation? Again, this is from a dynamicist. I did my PhD in physics. So from a physicist perspective, the first thing that we care about is the energy budget. So we have a budget of what goes in and out, and we know that it's not in equilibrium, and that we know the excess heat that goes in the system 90% goes to the ocean, 3% in ice, which is key because ice is very sensitive, it melts, and then it gets sea level rise, and it goes inland. So those numbers don't imply the importance, but deep oceans, I mean, the water's heat capacity is 1,000 more than the atmosphere, right? So it can store a lot more heat in the water. But that's why most of that goes. And if you look at the ocean depth, and most of it is in the deep ocean. So historically, we thought about the deep ocean as something we don't need to worry about. And then recent times, we've realized that that's where the heat is stored. So a lot of focus in physical oceanography over the past decade or so has been on how much you can exchange nutrients, heat, carbon between that very surface ocean and the depths of the ocean. And this plot here is showing I mean, we know that the atmosphere and ocean gets the excess heat at the equator to the poles, and that's really key to evolution of life on the planet. Without that, poles would be colder, equator would be warmer, and you would have much more turbulence in between. And the ocean does much less than the atmosphere, and almost all of that happens in the Atlantic Ocean. But the key is not that it's doing less, is that that's in connection with the atmosphere and the exchange and the ocean mixing that pushes that down ends up with this anthropogenic signal. Because we form deep waters in the North Atlantic, not in the North Pacific. I'll show you in a second.
But can you still, completely out of, explain the mechanism, what the heating makes in terms of?
Yes, that's what I'll be talking about. I'm just trying to model. That will be a good part of my talk. I'm just saying that heat budget is one of the reasons we care about the ocean, right? Just how we're warming up, how much of the heat is going where and on what time scales, and if it's slowing down or not. So when people talk about circulation collapse, then the question is, if it does actually collapse, what does it mean for the ocean uptake of anthropogenic heat and carbon, and what are the relevant time scales? What's the inertia in the system? Another reason we care about it, just with this part of the room, is carbon cycle. And that's where, for a physicist, you get a headache, because then you have to deal with chemistry, which is awful, and then biology, which is even worse, right? And so
coming from a physicist.
yeah, because you can't simplify biology. Unless if it's a snake and you assume it's two parallel lines that infinitely continue, you can't really simplify. But so I do study how the ocean circulation moves nutrients around, and it goes to phytoplankton, and then Nick can do that, but can also make sense of how that goes into chemistry and biology and the carbon. But I'm just showing this to make the point that, again, that would be a video which showed a lot of blue and red and temporal variability that shows the exchange of carbon between the atmosphere and the ocean. And then once in the ocean, a part of that carbon is just dissolved, and that leads to acidification and changes the carbonate chemistry of the upper ocean. That carbonate chemistry, which is just chemistry, is really key to the exchange of carbon. So when people talk about geoengineering, one set of approaches is to change the chemistry so you can get more carbon going into the ocean. Another set of solutions is to change the biology. So biological pump could actually send more carbon down. Now, biological pump is that the carbon that goes in gets fixed into shells of organisms. And if you zoom in, there are many of them. It's really diverse. And when they die, they sink. And when they sink, usually they dissolve. And so you can get carbon and nutrients from the surface and take it to the deep ocean. That's why when I talk about the deep circulation coming back to the surface, that's why the deep waters are very rich in nutrients. So whenever they upwell in the ocean, they get the surface, then they get light. Phytoplankton is light and food. So the food arrives, they have the light, boom, you get blooms. And that's why that's very seasonal in the northern and southern hemisphere. And some of this actually ends up in the sediment without getting dissolved. And that's basically, if you like, a permanent or very long-term extraction of carbon from the system into the solid air, right? And so when people talk about fertilization of the ocean, the idea is that you can boost that. That's called the biological pump. You can change that so you can actually store more. Now, this involves physics, chemistry, and biology, a lot of which we don't understand. Like in physical oceanography, we are still really dealing, there are nature papers that say that, oh, the water is going up, and then another nature paper says going down. But that's the state of the science, right? Is it up or down? And then the physics and chemistry, biology is complicated, and their interconnections is really, really complicated. So this is all very much open science questions. So that's the problem when you talk about geoengineering. You don't know what it's going to do to that, and you really can't force the knowledge to evolve on the time scale that you want. So that's the general problem in climate science.
So why you do not know? Because you don't understand the ingredients of the systems, or because you do not have access to monitor these systems to the seabed, to the bottom of the sea? Why?
It's both. It's observations. It's hard to observe the deep ocean just because light doesn't penetrate. Unlike the atmosphere that you can see through, you can't. So remote sensing with satellites, you can see stuff at the surface, but not deeper. So you have to go and do field work, and that's very expensive. So that's part. And then the oceans are very big.
Something sound.
Then we do use acoustics to look at the dynamics, or even some species. There are different ways of, but you have to still go and have an instrument and do things. And I'll show some global programs, but it's mostly because observations are expensive and sparse, and all of these chemistry, biology, physics are very variable in time and space. So it's not that you sample it here and there and it's just so sampling has been an issue. It's a system that's significantly undersampled. So scientific progress in this area has been primarily led by observations. So people observe something new and they're like, this makes sense of it. So
There's no
one.
way to understand it through simulation. No.
It's also a matter of time scale. This is a young field, right? 50 years ago, oceanographers would be people that would go to sea with a bucket, measure the salinity. And then suddenly they had to become scientists. So when I did my PhD in the physics department, and when they wanted to blame someone for not having done their job, they would say that, for God's sake, you're a physicist, not an oceanographer, right? So it is evolving very, very rapidly. Atmospheric science, much more advanced. Oceanography, less advanced. Biochemistry, biology, less advanced. Cryosphere, ice sheets, much less advanced. Cloud physics, less advanced. And the hierarchy that I said also maps to climate modeling. The first climate models were just the atmosphere. The next generation had a slab ocean, which was just 100 meters of water, just because they needed a heat capacity, so the heat could leave the atmosphere. So again, we built component after component.
There's also seasonal bias in the observational data, because the Southern Ocean is really important with carbon uptake, different traces, but you can't go to the Southern Ocean and collect data in the winter. It's just dangerous.
Yes, but Nick, what I'm trying to say, I mean, these seasonal biases, the complexity, all of this you can get in other fields as well. The main problem with oceans, because it's not ocean, is that you don't have data.
Yeah,
Because it's
exactly.
difficult to get it, right?
Exactly, that's what I mean. Yeah.
It's not constrained. Even our data assimilation products are not constrained. We constrain the surface ocean, where you have ultimately surface temperature, chlorophyll, things you can observe, and what we can sample in the upper ocean, but the deep ocean is really not constrained. And that's where a lot of the signal actually goes. And I'll talk about that briefly. The sort of tech development, autonomous systems that you can deploy globally, that's an area that's developing. A problem with that is the energy. How can you have batteries that can last long? You don't need to change them. We have Argo flows, they go to 2,000 meters, just like very stupid, just do this, and they're all over the ocean. And again, they're very simple because of the battery life. That's really the limitation. So that's an area of tech development that's needed. And then the AI revolution is actually really key. You can have chips that are smart, that have onboard AI chips, that they can actually communicate. Underwater communication is really key. So all of these are really developing, but the development of these on the scientific side is very slow, because you have to go to your Congress or Parliament and convince the politicians after many efforts to maybe give you 10 million or 20 million. And then geopolitics change and you lose those programs. So the big conversation that we've been having is how can you actually make these sustainable in a way that you can actually develop the tech. I think the digital twin is actually a very interesting framework through which we can have those conversations.
Can I ask this related to what Phoebe, because you asked about simulating, right?
Yes.
So can you just understand that when you have 0 to 1,000 meters, where you measure and measure, can you then extrapolate that and simulate the rest of those 3,000?
Yes, we simulate the whole thing.
Yeah,
And then
but
we-
can you extrapolate the data from, let's say, the measurable part to the non-measurable part?
In terms of dynamics,
To
in terms of the dynamics, you don't need to necessarily just extrapolate. You have conservation of mass, you have conservation of energy, you can write equations, right? And you can
Yeah.
force it at the surface at the boundaries and
Yeah.
just mass is going to be conserved. In terms of chemistry and biology is more complicated. And again, one of the things that Nick is developing is how can you use what you observe at the surface and some scientific knowledge and machine learning to actually extrapolate down. Even though you don't have enough data further down to constrain that process, but you have enough to verify what you get. So again, Nick was a very good person.
Just for clarification, and I will, do we have the because we've been to space, right? And billions have been given to extrapolate to space. At the moment, do we have the technology to go all the way down into the ocean and
Yes.
monitor? We do have. Is
Well-
the much?
Yes, depends on what you mean by we. If you ask the US Navy, yes, they do, but they don't share that. But how are you gonna source it? Again, I was actually asking Nick a question that's probably very stupid. The question was, why don't we have nuclear power for shipping? And then it took 30 seconds to get the answer, which is guessing. But I'm not suggesting we have nuclear drones going to the deep ocean. But the challenge is battery life. That's the main challenge, and communications. Because the instruments that we have, they have to come to the surface to communicate via satellites, right? Again, I'm giving away my ideas, but the technology is there to have towers that underwater communication is possible if you're close enough. The technology is there to have towers that come to the surface. Imagine you have a fleet of drones, the deep ocean, that can communicate together via that, and they can get information from remote sensing and data assimilation to know what they're actually on. That can be for exploration, monitoring, or any oceanographic work or otherwise. And you can source the energy for that in the open ocean from this, like what I refer to as a sea Tesla, like a Tesla station, but in the ocean. So I think there's great potential for development of energy harvested as a battery source in the ocean, not for the purpose of sending it inland. And that can actually help with it. So this would be a video that shows
But
the,
why is your video not working?
because it's a PDF.
Huh?
Because I have a Mac. Because this is, you don't have technology here, apparently. Don't worry about the oceans.
Thank you.
And it's a beautiful picture.
Yeah.
We can
Cannot
imagine.
connect to Mac, but it would be, you cannot.
Yes, NASA.
Of course, we can connect the Mac. Everybody has a Mac.
We can use our imagination. These move very slowly, so it wouldn't be crazy. They move very slowly. But the reason I'm showing this again is in terms of scales, right? This is 10,000 kilometers. And these are eddies. There are tens to hundreds of kilometers in diameter. One of these takes about a few weeks to go from here to here, when the Gulf Stream go from here to there. What I'm trying to show here is that this is sea surface temperature, right? And if you think about the temperatures on Earth, so this is really key to weather patterns, right? If the Gulf Stream stops or is modified, or the Arctic changes dramatically, it's going to impact the weather system in Europe and UK, right? That's why we really care about that. And elsewhere in the world. But what I want to show is that this is a very rich system. And the turbulence goes to scales that are molecular, where the energy is wasted. So the energy is put in the system at the global scale and is taken out of the system in sub-centimeter scale. And ideally, you would want to have all of that range in a model. And so computation is really expensive. So in climate modeling, basically all the challenges are how do you parameterize things? And also more fundamental question. what is the rate controlling process, right? So what is the thing that you need to care about first? And if you're a physicist or a chemist or a biologist, the answer to these could be very different. And historically, climate modeling, in terms of how it evolved, came from physics. Let's get the dynamics right. Then let's add nutrients. Then let's add, phytoplankton, zooplankton, increasingly fish. But now I think with the AI revolution and the AI-driven modeling, there is an opportunity to say that what is the main question you want to answer? How would you design a model to be tuned to actually shoot for that? So we don't necessarily prioritize the physics of the system. Because getting the circulation 80% right to 100%, that tuning that you require to do might come at the cost of getting your biological ecosystems wrong, right? So how do you decide where to put the errors in favor of getting something that you're interested in more accurate? Okay, that's not the conversation we had in the IPCC modeling framework. So if you simplify the circulation, this is what we get. Now going to your question, why is most of the heat transported in the Atlantic Ocean? The Atlantic Ocean, you have a lot of waters that sink to the deep ocean. For example, off the coast of Denmark Strait, right? And that's because of the seasonality of sea ice. When you form sea ice, the salt doesn't go in the ice, it's rejected, and you end up with very cold, salty water. So temperature changes the water density, cold is denser, and salinity, high salinity also makes it denser. So when you have sea ice formation, you end up with very cold, salty water that's very heavy, and it sinks to the deep ocean. That happens in the North Atlantic, and a few places, Ross Sea, Weddell Sea, and a few limited other places around Antarctica. And the entire deep ocean is filled with water that are formed at these very few locations. Right, that's really cool. So when in the news you see the hypersensitivity to whatever happens in polar regions, Arctic and Antarctica, is because they have a disproportionate impact on climate everywhere. And the reason is that that's where you actually fill up the deep ocean, right? And it just, and then from there it goes on. Now, why do we form deep waters in the Atlantic, but not in the Pacific or Indian? You would think we would know the answer to that. I don't think we actually do. There are debates. One idea, which is really groundbreaking, is that this goes further north. And so it's in the Atlantic. Here land stops here, there you have water going further north. So the boundaries of the ocean goes further north, so it gets colder. But it's more complicated. If you think about the atmospheric patterns, they go west and east, the winds. And so, for example, you have a dry band here because the water, the air that goes over this part of the continent, and there's a lot of rain, and you lose the water content. So by the time you get to go over Africa, you don't have much moisture, right? You're not going to get much rainfall. Whereas the air that goes there has a lot of moisture, and you actually end up getting a lot of rainfall and green. So those patterns really matter. And for example, we know from the past that when the ocean circulation in the Atlantic collapsed in the past, which has happened in the past, it changed the meridional heat transport by the ocean almost immediately. And then the atmospheric circulation had to compensate for that heat exchange. And what that means is that these bands of rainfall actually shift north and south. So one way that we can reconstruct past circulations is just by the vegetation bands that are in fossil records on land. And you know that, oh, okay, this was a rainforest and this was a desert, and you can see that, and that you can very accurately calculate what that means in terms of the strength of the ocean circulation.
Do we know why it happened in the past? You're talking millions of years ago.
And no event has hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of years ago.
Oh.
You know, we have events that were really extreme in the glacial, interglacial cycles that suddenly
Do
collapse.
we have causality for that, or just observation that it happened?
No, there's causality. Actually, Denmark has been pioneering in actually doing that sort of research. In general, Scandinavian nations have and in the field of oceanography, most of our most prominent, famous oceanographers come from that region. There are many records there. Yes, we do understand the reasons. It's not that complicated.
My question was related. One was the last that the circulation collapsed. But related to that,
I'll show you some records, but it depends on what we mean by collapse. But there is one thing that usually when we say AMR collapse we refer to is that the seasonality of sea ice is very important to that sinking, right? And if you lose the entire sea ice of the Arctic, if you hit a threshold that it doesn't recover anymore, then you're not gonna have that, so you're gonna cut that down. Now, it's very easy to think that the circulation is gonna stop, but there's inertia in the system, so it takes time, hundreds of years. But if you cut that graph, if you close that, then you're gonna change that, right? So the circulation changes. Whereas, the part that you have warm water here and colder there, so water and the earth is rotating. So that means that the waters have to be pushed along the western boundaries and go north or south, depending on what hemisphere you are. So the Gulf Stream is not gonna go away, even if you don't have Arctic sea ice. But the gradient is really key. And if you change that, you're gonna change the strength of the Gulf Stream. You're gonna change where it separates from one continent and reaches Europe, right? And if you move that north or south, you're gonna change the heat that gets to Europe. Like the reason why the UK's weather is not very cold, even though it goes very high, is because it gets the heat coming from the Gulf Stream. So we have a new big program in the UK, National Capability Center, which is entirely focused on things that happen in the Arctic. Is it going to impact how much heat we get in the UK? Which if you live there, you wouldn't think is a lot, but apparently it could be worse. That's what
Getting better.
Yeah. But in terms of timescales, to get a sense of the history in the system, imagine if your water pulsar is sinks there to the deep ocean, and then through various dynamical processes, you go south. In the Southern Ocean, winds push waters up. And the reason is that the Southern Ocean is the only place that there's no continents blocking the flow. So you start getting jets going around, similar to jet stream in the atmosphere. And as a result of that, we form this jet system. Now, on a rotating sphere, in the southern hemisphere, if a jet is going that way, the rotation sort of also pushes the water north. You can think of Coriolis force. If you're in a car going around the curve, you get pushed, in the direction central. So that pushes the waters north, and that's that. And because in the south there's land, then to conserve mass, when you push the water north, you have to bring waters from the deep, right? That's the process called Ekman transport. So in the Southern Ocean, because of that system, you have a lot of deep waters coming up. They're rich in nutrients. And one of the things that has happened recently is that the anthropogenic heat that runs in the system here for the past couple of 100 years, in the past decade, has started coming up under the ice shelves through this process. So there's an asymmetry in the timescale of the system. So wind brings those waters up. They can then end up in different basins, and then turbulence helps bring those waters further back up in the same way that you mix cream in your coffee with a spoon. It's just tides going over rough topography, undersea mountains, creating turbulence, brings those waters up, go to the Indonesian through flow, rich nutrients waters. That's why this region is so rich ecologically, right? It's just because of that deep nutrient-rich waters that go here or go around the coast of Australia, very rich and biologically very rich. Find a river back, as well as currents around Africa, go to the North Atlantic. That takes about 10,000 years. So the oldest waters that come up in the Pacific Ocean, they're about 8,000 years, right? So they do feel the climate change when they come up.
The oldest or the youngest?
The oldest waters that we have. And we can measure that using radiocarbon dating. Right, that's done in the ocean. You get the water pulsar, you get the radiocarbon signal. So that mean over here.
I mean, when I was last in the Vatican, there was the CEO of the Asian Bank of Reconstruction and Development. And he really needed to understand all of this in addition to the blue economy part. So this guy that we are having in a meeting, Ali has to be in that meeting because he wants to understand all this. And we don't have the expertise.
I would be happy to talk to any development banker. Okay. I tend to have something I need.
He's a very clever, so
Anytime, sure. So if you average that in that direction in your mind, then you get a picture like that, which in oceanography we use a lot. So if you see anything like this, that's basically that, average like that. So that's the Arctic, water they're sinking, that's Antarctica, and this is circulation going around. And in this case, you see an upper branch of circulation, which would be in the Atlantic, and the deeper one, which is in the other basins. Now, this is showing oxygen. So whenever you see purple is water with higher oxygen content, it means that that water was in touch with atmosphere more recently. Right, so here and there. And once it's in the ocean, it gets consumed biologically. So the waters that are low in oxygen, which are usually rich in nutrients, those are the waters that that the oldest. They've been in the ocean for a long time. So we can use different tracers to figure out where waters came from. We can get waters, look at their temperature, salinity, oxygen, nutrients, and then figure out where they come from. And the fact that all of the waters in the deep ocean come from few places in the polar region is very useful because you have source waters, but you can actually trace where they come from. It's a bit like a forensic investigation, but it's an easy forensic experiment because there are only 4 potential murderers. So
That's very handy.
Yes. I just said it's very good that you only have 4 murderers. So don't take that out of context. So coming back here, sorry to make you move. I just wanna be there. So this is the circulation in the background. The colors green, red means is clockwise, blue means counterclockwise. Now this is actual data. You get a climate model. This is the MIT General Circulation Model. You assimilate all the data that you have from remote sensing, from floats, from ships. You constrain the solution, you get a circulation, and that's what's plotted. So the colors are more or less correct. So this circulation is about 18 sphere drops. Each sphere drop is 10 to the 6 cubic meter per second. So that's the size of the circulation, and this is more or less around the same. Now, just want to show this to talk about turbulence, not because my PhD was on it, but because it is how you bring the deep waters up. And like I said, if you imagine it's your coffee cup, you have heavy cream, cold from the sides, going deep. If you have a cup of coffee and you pour cream on the sides and let it sink to the bottom very slowly and don't touch it, how long do you think it takes for molecular diffusion to mix the cream and the coffee? Any guesses?
Too long.
The coffee will be cold.
But that depends on your patience, right?
Yeah, but 2 hours for the coffee. I mean, it's too long for that particular.
So
A day? How big is the
a day, 2 hours a day?
1 month.
Who said never? Why did you say that?
Because it's asymptotically and it's going somewhere, it's a limit, I mean, it's not gonna reach.
I mean, that's kind of correct. It takes about 2 weeks for a regular cup. And the time scale of it,
That's what I said, 1 month.
2 was correct.
2 was correct, yes. 2 Greek hours. But in that time, we know that,
This place is getting out of control, right?
but you start.
It's becoming big.
It's becoming big, yeah.
But it takes, as we know, it takes a few days for the liquid to evaporate. Right, so never is correct. You're never gonna get it mixed. You just end up with this disgusting layer of whatever at the bottom of your cup that you have to.
Like it sounds like an experiment.
Well, I have a big office and people come offer them coffee, you know, they just leave the cup. So every Monday I have to go up in the kitchen and start. When you become the co-director, can you please deal with that?
Move the cups.
Because you're co-director of operations, that's your job. And no, he was a butcher, remember? He's not.
Yeah, I remember.
So you need to steer, and that's the power of turbulence. You go from 2 weeks to a second, to a fraction of a second. And the reason why turbulence is very good at mixing things is that molecular diffusion is very slow, but if you get a filament of coffee and stretch it a lot, very quickly, you increase the surface area of cream and coffee by orders of magnitude, and the molecular diffusion can mix it very
Yeah,
quickly.
but the important thing is when the turbulence stops, how long it will take to go back to the initial state where you wouldn't have the mixing. You know what I'm?
Yeah, not to undo it, but to reshape the system.
Yes.
Depends on what depths you are. If you're above here, it's annual, even from daily cycles to annual to.
So it's human time scale.
Yeah, operate here, but if you're here, then it's millennial.
Millennium, yeah.
But like I said, one key question is how much of the heat here goes there, right?
Because it's
So that
exactly
transfer
the
is
same
like-
with
yeah.
groundwater.
Yeah.
When you are up,
Yeah.
it's human
Yeah.
scale. When you are down,
Yeah.
it's millennia, and it gets
And
impossible.
the exchange between those timescales, which end up being parameters in climate models, are very uncertain, right? So we don't have good grip on how rapidly you mix carbon and heat from here to here. This is just showing the processes. You have tidal flow similar to a beach. Okay, waves roll up and break. The same thing happens underwater beaches. Anybody seen SpongeBob SquarePants? They have underwater beaches, and it's exactly the same, right? It just happens all over here. And waters are denser, remember, it's like layered. Here it's denser, here it's less dense. And it goes around seamounts and so forth. So we do study quite a bit those turbulence processes in the group. Now, a few important points. One, so hopefully that gives you a sense of the time scales and length scales in the system, right? They're very long. You go from millennial to seconds, centimeter to the entire globe. Now the question is, for a given problem, how much should you care about what range of that record, right? So this is a paper by Peter Hoiber's group at Harvard, came out a long time ago, I think 2004, but I really like this. This is, they call it energy, but this is, you can think of it as sea surface temperature. And this is the spectral decomposition of that into frequency domain. So this is over a year. So this is 1 year, that's the annual cycle. You get the seasonal cycle, you get the daily cycle, right? And so forth. If you had it for 1 million years, you would get the glacial interglacial cycles. If you had it for, there are cycles that we know that make sense from a physical perspective. Now, this is the key. This is a bicoherence plot. It shows whether there is significant correlation between information at one time scale with another. Whenever you see blue, it means that it's significant. And this is in 1 over a year. So this is 100 years. This is a day. This is
So
a
you
year.
can retrieve about millennium, right?
Yeah, this is just a 100-year time scale. We can go back 500 million years. Not sure. But what this shows is that the information, the daily surface temperatures correlates strongly with the signal on a 100-year time scale, right? So if you want to do weather prediction, the models that you use in terms of how you force them should have some of that memory in. And the longer you want to predict out, the more of that memory you need to have in.
Can I ask the correlation coefficient of that? As a statistician,
Yeah,
It's 0.45.
it's points, yeah, that's
that's the
yeah,
correlation.
0.4, 0.5. And we can do the same thing for different time scales. So that's the key. Now, they stop here. If you go further back, it gets weak, right? So the point here is that for daily or
But is it
weekly,
enough to retrieve? Sorry, I'm talking too much, but I'm wondering, 0.5 correlation, is it enough to retrieve data about millennium? Can you make the connection?
no, but this is a short record. We have longer records, right? So this is just a short record. This is modern observations, 100-year, right? We've had observations of surface temperatures for 100 years.
Okay.
For millennia, you have to rely on fossils and proxies in the system. And
0.45 means that you can explain around 20% of the variability of the other parameter that you are thinking of. It's 20%.
So this is now a longer record, right? This is a 65 million year. So I'm in an earth science department, so frequently you go to seminar, people talk about the recent past, and they're talking about 10 million years ago, which when I moved to the department, I found hilarious. But now this is, you can just look at the top and think of it as temperature. Don't worry about this axis. This is temperatures of the deep ocean. Now, the way we reconstruct them is look at the shells of organisms. Some of them are planktonic, so these formed at the surface of the ocean and then they sank. Some of them form at the seafloor, they're bendy. And when they form a shell and they built in oxygen or carbon. And there are different isotopes of oxygen and carbon in the ocean, and the weight, the fraction of, let's say, oxygen 16 to 18, the weight, the fraction that gets and ends up in their shells really depends on the temperature of the water they're formed in, right? So you can actually extract the shells, again, from the deep ocean. This involves going to the seafloor, 5,000 meters deep, a few thousand meters deep, drill a core. So these are major international collaboration. So this is one of those fields that historically a lot of countries have to come together to fund. And then you take them to your lab, and then you break the piece, and then somebody has to go and break it and find these. These are tiny, they're like micron, really easily 1/10 of a millimeter and much smaller. And you have to find them and then clean them and then go to mass spectrometer or other instruments. And that's why we have graduate students. And so you can build that sort of information and go all the way back, and that's the error bars to 65 million years. Now, we can do the same thing with carbon. And this is from many land-based and benthic and marine-based carbon reconstruction of atmospheric CO2. Key points, we are now here, and if you go back, around here in the Eocene, 35 million years ago, the carbon dioxide levels were where we think we were going. So and that was a hothouse climate. We had, there were big mammals on Antarctica and rainforests back then. So I showed this in Japan when you invited me, and I said there were mammals, there were dinosaurs. Then after the talk, somebody came to me and said, you can't call yourself an earth scientist, and said there were dinosaurs 30 million years ago. But these are not dinosaurs, they're mammals. But pointing that the climate was very different. So that's very interesting phase. Now, you can look at this, and you can look at different proxies, and you learn many things. One thing, so look at just this one. This is, we talk about 1.5, right, or 2 degrees. This is, this is about over 2 degrees in a very short period of time. This is called PETM, using thermal maximum. We know that about 2,000 gigatons of carbon was released in the atmosphere over 2,000 years. We have done more over 200 years, and it led to a complete marine life extinction. Like in the records, it's just completely gone. And it took thousands of years for it to start recovering.
Sorry, when was that?
That's 60, 50, between 55 and 60 million years ago. Long ago. But
Millions, millions.
yes, this is million years. But again, you can come forward. This was a mini mass extinction. And we can look at the carbon and the temperature and the shells and other tracers. So I'm showing this to make the point that in the past, there were times that the carbon levels were higher, the temperatures was much higher. That is fairly common in the Earth's history. And if you look further back, it was even crazier. I don't know if anybody knows George Carlin. He was an American comic, and he had this routine which I really liked, which was about, this is from the 80s or 90s, and it was just unloading as he did on people that said we are hurting the planet. And his point was that the planet is fine, we are effed. Right? And the point was that the planet has experienced a lot more. But there's a lot of information about sensitivity of different species around the globe. You can actually look at the spatial location and how they reacted to changes to acidification, to the temperatures, to the carbon. And there's a lot of this information in the paleoclimate community. And people that study them know a lot about the climate system, really holistically. They know about the dynamics and chemistry and biology really deeply, but they just don't necessarily care about connecting it with, not all of them, most of them don't. And so it's been sort of like a niche area people in the UK do, and they become fellows of the Royal Society, and they write a book and they die. So one of the things I'm trying to do in the department is to try to use AI and actually connect the past to the future. And you can have dynamical systems framework. You can have physical frameworks that have equations, right? That you can look at oscillations and tipping points and bifurcations in the system. And then in that, there will be some knobs. And then you can say, I have a lot of records from the history of the Earth. I could tune those knobs based on the history of the Earth We can use them quantitatively and then say that, okay, now I have a bit more degree of confidence in running this
But do
forward
you
in
have
time.
enough structure breaks
Do you have enough?
that you can identify history? So to do that, you need structural breaks in terms of the variation, the standard deviation from a mean that you would consider the equilibrium, let's say.
It depends on the question you're asking, but you can ask questions for which the answer would be yes. We can use the past 10,000 years, the past glacial interglacial cycle to say a lot using what I
How many
explained about.
significant incidences you had during that period?
I mean, this is very long period. If I showed this just for the past couple of millions of years, where we had glacial interglacial cycles, we've had many. Do you know that we had 10, order of 10
I was
on
thinking-
radio cycles? We've had about an order of 10 cycles where there was dramatic change to ocean circulation with huge implications.
Okay, that's probably enough if you have at least.
You had a question?
Yes, I was actually very similar to this one. I was wondering if we have a record of 2.5 or 3 degrees Celsius. The implications to the planet and the years.
Yeah, we do have around here.
It's more than 2.5.
Yeah, but also in here, right, thinking about glacial, what's that? How, do you know how much lower the mean global temperatures were during the last glacial maximum? I don't. You know, one of the holy grails in physical oceanography for years, for decades, was to figure out where 120 ppm of carbon dioxide went during the glacial ocean periods. We knew it was in the ocean, just didn't know where it was. And we still don't know actually how it happened. And then in the process of the past decade, it really exceeded the change in CO2 levels between glacial and interglacial cycles just anthropogenically. So now the signal we have is even much larger than that.
At least statistics can give you a lot of answers. It doesn't have to be all AI.
I would love to see statisticians talk to data climate scientists. I would love to see that.
Yeah, because, I mean, this is what we do. We investigate time series.
No, I mean, I'm joking, people
Yeah.
work at statistics, but I think that the machine learning, some colleague
Yes.
has created a framework in which people can come and talk about tools.
Yes.
So I'm not suggesting people in this field don't know things, they know a lot.
And can I ask
Yes.
you one? Also, in this models that you were trying to create, can you also integrate how technologies and specific interventions could decrease the impact of all these changes? For example, this could be intervention either on the land or to have specific technologies, for example, that could absorb the CO2 from the sea. So something that would actually support the to have a lesser impact on the planet.
Yes, I'll come to that in a bit. That's a very good question, because this is not the type of I study. But the key point I want to make is that the way that the system functioned was different in the past. And sometimes it really changed. For example, the deep ocean or the past of modern ocean for the past thousands, arguably millions of years, has been driven by the tides and the spoon and cream mixing. But we think that it was very different here, right? And we don't still know how, but we have evidence that it was driven differently. Because yes.
Yeah, sorry. I recall in so Attenborough was speaking at the COP, showing the atmospheric content of CO2, and saying more or less it was stabilized for the last 10,000 years, around 250, and now we're.
That's supposed.
Is it the same for the oceans?
Yeah,
So
that's
that
what we call it.
you have stable, that we have can figure out how much it was stable in the past. And was it the same 10,000 years?
Yeah, I mean, that's post-last glacial maximum, what we refer to as the Holocene, right? With our civilizations evolved in a stable form that we know, so that's the significance of that. But as a species, we did go to the glacial cycle after that. So the ocean circulation has been more or less the same over the past 10,000 years. So the temperature changes a fraction of a degree. So it's been pretty stable. And very good, he is a graduate of my department, so. He's a graduate of my department, so it's.
That's why.
What he said is correct. So I talked about this too much. And don't worry about that. No, don't worry about it actually. This is showing you a spectral decomposition of a signal. If you do statistics or physics or math, you can do that. And you get a continuous signal. It could be a temperature measurement. You could measure the temperature in this room over time. You get a signal, you can decompose it and see how much energy is in what frequency or in what length scale, right? And for those of you that come from math or physics, if you did that to a signal that just had a sine or a cosine, you would just get one peak. If you added sines and cosines linearly, you would just get some peaks, right? Whenever you see a spectral curve where the signal is continuous, we call it a continuum, it means that processes in the system are non-linearly interacting. And when you look at any record in the Earth, it's just always like that. There's continuum of information. And when you see that, it means information is going in different directions. This goes from, millions of years to hundreds of thousands of years to 10,000 years to 1,000 years to hundreds of years to annual and back and forth. But to summarize the system, if you think about your daily weather, you're talking about daily cycle, right? And then what really matters is the seasonality. You care about the annual, interannual cycles. That's more atmosphere. Ocean is moving sufficiently slow that they can just worry about atmosphere, right? You need the ocean information as a background, but the atmosphere is the one that's moving faster. Once you start talking about decadal prediction, that you actually really need to worry about ocean circulation changes. Once you start thinking about centennial, then you actually have to start worrying about ice in the polar oceans, right? Ice sheets, Antarctica and Greenland. So I would extend this to centennial. And then the ice sheets that grow on the continents, the time scales relevant to them is from thousands of years to millions of years. And millions of years is now the time scale of tectonic motions, right? And when you have tectonic motions, it changes the shape of the ocean, but it also changes the moment of inertia of the Earth. It changes the gravitational force between Earth and other planets, changes the orbital parameters, the solar insolation. But almost immediately, continental motions has outgassing, right? Volcanoes, deep sea volcanoes. And that immediately goes to the atmosphere, changes the temperature. So tectonic motions can change the system on very different, almost immediately, and then longer time scales. The point being that if you just take the question of Antarctic ice sheets instabilities, if you lose all the ice on Greenland, the global sea level is going to rise by about a meter. No, 6-7 meters. If you lose all the ice on Antarctica, it's about 60 meters. And 60 meters is a lot, right? I have a student who's from Amsterdam. So whenever I say that, I just wait, goodbye. So if you really want to care about ice sheet dynamics in a climate model, knowing that if you lose a good chunk of Antarctica suddenly, the sea level is going to change almost immediately with huge global impact, the knowledge you need to build into your models that actually involves the rock bed on which it formed, because that sets the instabilities that can grow. Right? And the formation of that is now tectonic motion million-year time scale. So that's why it's very difficult. The turbulence I talked about is, time scales go all the way to seconds and scales of a centimeter. And in the climate community, you have all of these people that are trying to pull it all together. And I haven't even touched on chemistry or biology, which is very complicated in its own right. So the history in the system really matters. And
what is the blue in the
ocean?
no in the above?
This is more complicated, but the point of this would be that, again, how many physicists we have here? We had a few. So I think physicists would actually really like that. The nice thing about that is that when you have a nonlinear dynamical system, you get a continuum. And the slope of that continuum tells you something about processes. Like Kolmogorov-Curie ocean turbulence, we have a slope of -5 there, right? Physicists are obsessed with these slopes. something very
Not
interesting
only
happened.
physicists, statisticians, Koundouri was a mathematician, so.
Yes,
it's
and mathematicians.
Basically, statistics, what you're talking about.
people like stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so everybody. But what happens here is that when you look at these long records that go to million years, you actually realize that the slope smoothly transitions from one associated with nonlinear dynamics within the Earth, like the inside the planet. You have mantle convection, core dynamics, and all of that. That gives you a slope. And from that, you smoothly go to the slopes of the ice sheet dynamics. And so all of this is really smooth. And this is coming from the deep ocean temperatures, the shells that I showed you. And this is now 10 million year time scale. So the temperatures of the deep ocean, the slope of the nonlinear dynamics there on 10 million year time scale is almost exactly the same as the slope you get from the dynamics inside the Earth. And this is from reconstruction of the thermal heat flux from the solid Earth into the ocean. And the way they get that is that they recreate the continents going back in time, and they constrain that using paleomagnetic data, because the magnetism is known. And as the rocks know, you can still see the traces that, oh, this was aligned this way back then, and that way and that way. So you can work that out. So the dynamics inside the Earth that informs the system has the same slope on 10 million year time scale as the deep ocean temperatures that these organisms recorded. I just find that quite. You have two very different dynamical systems.
Yeah, but the blue one
converge.
has increasing variance, and you might have roughly similar slopes, but the increasing variance, what does it say?
With the resolution of the data.
It's just the resolution.
Yeah, these
I
are
thought
the-
it was something interesting.
No, because of the resolution. These are very different
Ah.
concepts.
So if this temperature dynamics of the deep sea are happening on this slow scale, do we have to worry then about?
So, you don't, but I do. Because I think what it implies is that we know that the deep temperatures in the modern Earth, modern being the past couple of 3 million years, is set by the circulation. But my hypothesis, which got me my job, is that it wasn't always the case. That there was a time that the deep circulation wasn't as efficient as connecting the surface to the bottom, and you would have more stagnant waters in the deep ocean. And there, the thermal heat flux from the interior would set the temperatures. And if that's true, and if you can show that, then the plot I showed of the temperatures going back in time, even 100 to 10,000 year time scale, we might be misinterpreting that by saying that, oh, the climate was much warmer, right? Because it could be that the climate wasn't necessarily warmer, the deep ocean was more isolated from the rest of the climate system. So it has importance in terms of how we interpret the climate of the past through the records that we reconstruct. I just want to finish up because I think people also need to have lunch. So just gonna make 2 points. One, which is again connecting the past to the future, which is sort of one thing that when I find time, I actually sit down and try to build models. Next actually thesis was on the same topic going forward in time, is that we have this thing in the climate system known as the bipolar seesaw, which would be if you cool one pole, the other one would warm up, and when this one cools off, the other one would be warming up. And the reason is that because of the circulation, when you have a signal here, it takes time for it to go to the other side and that. And the circulation in the Southern Ocean is deeper, the one that initiates in the Southern Ocean, and the one that is initiated in the Arctic is shallower. So the time scale of this is centennial, time scale of this is millennial. So the deep ocean, you can think of it as a buffer, right? And you have centennial to millennial buffer. And the system has always had time to adjust. So, and you can go through the phenomenology of what happens if, as one example, if you lose the sea ice and shut down the deep water formation in the North Atlantic, you're gonna shut down the circulation, right? But then when you shut down the circulation, you're not gonna get as much heat from the equator to the Arctic, right? And then it gets colder again and you start forming sea ice. And that time scale of adjustment is centennial because it takes time for that signal to go through the system. If you make changes to Antarctica, that takes even longer to get and come back. And this was always the case in the history. We know that we had bipolar seesaws. This is now 10,000-year timescale, and these are the dramatic events I was telling you about. Now, a big question in the science community is, are we actually changing that? Is the present Earth changing? Are we heating it so rapidly that it doesn't have time to go through these adjustments? Both poles are just heating up. And this is temperature records from 1979 to 2005. This is the warming signal. It's much stronger in the north because we have more land in the northern hemisphere, right? And we can extend it to present day. But the key is that the two hemispheres, like as Arctic and Greenland lost ice, up to that point, Antarctica was in the net gaining ice mass, right? And over time, in recent times, that has changed. And one hypothesis, which I think is correct, is that, and that has to do with the fact that the heat that went there, it took decades to a century to get to Antarctica. Now we are at the stage that this heat is finding its way under the Antarctic shelves, and we are losing a lot of mass. And the records, we can see that only in recent times, this is, I can't read them, but this would say that for the past decade,
And we are
the Antarctic
confident
ice is actually going down very much more rapidly than it did in the past.
Are we confident this is anthropogenic?
I would say we don't have long enough of records to be able to say that statistically. We can go through the phenomenology and causality and show that, but we can't make that point statistically, and we don't have all models agreeing with that. But models are really tuned. The first time that Trump got elected, I was visiting Boulder, Colorado, and they have this model called CESM, which is one of the main models of the IPCC framework. They had CESM2 about to release. They were running late for a month. This was right when he was elected. And they were late because the model was giving significant global cooling. And not only they had to figure out what the issue was to fix that, but they had to keep it a secret, because if it leaked, then it would be the major national lab that creates the model it was very fun time to be there. They were all very stressed. They figured it out. It had to do with cloud feedback. But my point is that these models are very, very tuned, right? So they're very, very sensitive. You can build lower complexity models, and many of them, and then and you can show that statistically, phenomenologically. The problem is that results that you get there then don't always survive when you go to the full complexity, because you don't have all the feedbacks. But we have the observation. So the last one question, is it anthropogenic? But nevertheless, it is going away, and we have to deal with that. And I think it's very important to make a distinction between them, so geopolitics don't hurt our observational programs, right? Whether it's anthropogenic or not, ecosystems around Antarctica are going to be impacted, or in the Arctic are going to be impacted, and we have to deal with it.
Yes, but knowing the source is important for managing the phenomenon, right?
I know, but my point is that if we had made that distinction more clearly, we wouldn't be necessarily now having the problem that we have in the US with.
Yeah,
some
yeah,
people.
that's
The question is relative point of view to be, channel the money now to mitigation or to mitigation, right? That's the main point of the question. If it's how much of it is anthropogenic? I mean, the physics is there, right? The greenhouse gas effect is, studied. It's a physical rule. We know that, but still, how much can we still mitigate?
If at all.
Yeah,
Or is it just
If at all.
If at all.
full adaptation at this point?
Yeah.
I mean, the memory.
Because the money resources we have to tackle it
Are
are limited, so we have to decide on.
I agree, and it really depends on the questions you ask. Like one of my colleagues that you've met, Oscar Branson, so he's looking at these trends and he's interested in coral reefs, because he likes scuba diving. He wouldn't admit
So
to it.
I meet him and he asked me, do we move the coral reefs to other areas, or do we conserve them? And I go, I mean,
No, but that's depends on the questions you ask.
oh, we glad. Sorry,
No, okay, so I think there is evidence that those poles are heating up dramatically.
Yes,
Now,
that's-
one thing that we recently in my group, in collaboration with Scripps Institution of Oceanography in San Diego, using a lot of Argo flows data and ship-based data, is the following. This is showing CDW, which is called circumpolar deep waters. You can think of it as waters that come from the northern hemisphere, let's say from the Atlantic, and they're really warm. They have the anthropogenic signal, because we know that that ended up in the ocean. We know that for a fact. And this red shows that those waters are expanding around Antarctica. This shows that waters that are formed around Antarctica and sink to the deep ocean, which actually take quite a bit of anthropogenic carbon into the deep ocean and store it, is blue, so that's shrinking. So that says that the warm waters from the north are, dominating over Antarctica, and the shelf waters that form around Antarctica, which are really key, because they're cold, but they don't have any salt, so they stay on top, and they shield the ice shelves from the warm waters that are underneath. So the fact that this is blue, it means that that protection is going away and more heat is getting to the ice shelves. So now we have 4 decades of data, actual data, over the top 2 kilometers of the ocean, and statistically significant from a lot of thousands of floats that do it all the time. And then we can use, empirical orthogonal functions, or in machine learning language with the principal component analysis.
And in the
And you can-
econometrics language.
Yeah, and going back to your question, you can show that the first principal component is a trend, and the second, third, and others could be described in terms of the known modes of climate variability. Right?
What's the second
The
component?
second, third, and others can be described in terms of the known modes of climate variability.
Okay.
Like Atlantic.
And if we say the principal component is the anthropogenic.
No, we're just saying that there's a trend. There could be a longer variability that we don't have observational record for, so statistics is not significant. Well, it is not the Atlantic decadal oscillation or the Pacific decadal oscillation or Southern annual mode. It's not the ones that we know are modes of variability of this. It's not ENSO, it's not the ones that we know. It is a trend. Now, if you're a climate modeler, you would say that, of course, it's anthropogenic. I have a model, I put heat in it, it heats up, and the ice melts. What's the mystery, right? But if you're a statistician, you would be very careful not to draw causality. And this debate in the climate community has been going on for decades.
Just
And
because
they are-
climate scientists do not understand that correlation is different than causality.
don't say that.
In addition to
No,
one,
it's not very that.
the statistic.
No.
Because we are
Because
looking
I
at
forgot
the
the question.
statistic
What
of
do you
the-
need to say that it's anthropogenic? So, what's missing in your model that you cannot see is
I think the fact that excess heat is getting to the Southern Ocean, that's anthropogenic. That we know, because the heat is a temperature anomaly that's linked to anthropogenic carbon, which has chemical footprints that we can measure, rate, and data. But we know that. What we can say is whether the fact that it's more of it is getting to Antarctica, it's because of variability in the system, things slow up and speed up and slow down, speed up. Or whether the trend itself that the heat is going more on Antarctica, the trend that itself is because of the change to dynamics because of climate change. That's the part we can say.
How strong?
Uh,
strong?
So it's 4 decades. This is 4 decades.
I got it.
So we know the trend is. So and you can. It's very easy.
Where it comes from.
It's not. And then from there on, I'm out of time, so I'm not gonna go. We can get that heat. This is the heat. That's the shelf water that protects it. You can actually start looking at ice shelves. That's the shelf water that protects it. That's the warm water from underneath. And you can look at the formation seasonality go around Antarctica and then get what I said and actually connect it to the heat that goes under ice sheets, right? Ice shelves. And then you can talk to glaciologists, Jerome Newfolk and others and say that, what does that actually mean for ice sheets, right? And then we can take it from there. And if I had another few hours, I would talk about the chemistry and a lot of what I said, the changes that I just talked about, minute changes to the surface stratification of density and turbulence in the Southern Ocean, really minute. And when I say minute, I mean, this is what in climate models we call background values, a value that is just set to something very small and don't worry about. Not turbulence because of storms in Southern Ocean, just very background in the ocean. You tweak that a little bit within errors that we don't care, and you change the air sea flux of carbon over the Southern Ocean, which is a main sink of carbon, by 100% over a few years. But the system is really hypersensitive. And you can understand why, because the biology in the upper ocean is very nutrient limited. Southern Ocean is very iron limited. There's nutrients and light in the right season, there's no iron. You just inject a tiny bit of iron, just get boom, blooms, right? And so you change the turbulence, the dynamics that I was talking about very slightly, you can actually change that balance and change the air sea fluxes.
So we don't do geoengineering. Sorry.
There's a reason that iron fertilization is usually done off the coast of Chile where you have an upwelling zone with nutrients, right? And so Southern Ocean would be, actually this project, former student of mine was, he started it with the idea of being able to talk about iron fertilization.
I think that they were.
No, I'm not, you can see I was going there, but I'm not a fan of iron fertilization.
That's.
No. No, so just making the point and happy to send links that we have connected what I just said and what you asked to potential carbon cycle and green CO2 removal technologies and making the point that you said that this is really uncertain. One of the things that my student, Sophie, who is now on leave, maternity leave did. So Sophie worked with David Attenborough quite a bit. She's an experienced BBC writer, director, producer, and the Planet Earth series and so forth. I tried really hard to convince her that what she was doing was much more interesting than doing a PhD. She was in Tanzania filming cheetahs when she did her PhD interview. I was like, why would you want to sit in a room and just look at them? Anyway, that was her job. But she's looked at zooplankton that eat phytoplankton and their grazing rate. So she's made me read quite a number of papers about zooplankton food. I never thought in my career I would be spending time on that. But what she has shown is very interesting, that just very slight changes in the conditions of the ocean changes their appetite, to the point that changes how much they eat of what and where of phytoplanktons, and that changes the phytoplankton dynamics. And phytoplankton is not only the base of the food chain in the ocean, but it's also how you have the biological pump getting carbon and sinking. So there's a feedback just in terms of grazing and eating habits of phytoplanktons.
What changes their food habits? What changes their food appetite? What changes?
The chemistry in the water, the temperatures and so forth changes the phytoplanktons, and then your appetite changes based on that. And again, making the point that and now in ecosystem models, the grazing rate of zooplankton is just one coefficient used for all zooplankton eating any phytoplankton anywhere ever. But imagine if you model all of our eating habits, just one coefficient across the globe. It's just that's the level of this. Yeah. And this is when my conversation with Phoebe started. I very excitingly said that, oh, me and Nick are working with this student, we're doing socioeconomic modeling using dice, and she very politely said that we could do better than that. And so hopefully we're gonna do better than that. So hopefully that gives you a sense of my world and the uncertainties and the timescales and things we know and we don't know. Which is a good thing because I have a job because of that. Thank you.
Ali, this was magnificent. I will stay for hours, not forever, but for hours listening to you. It was truly very nice and inspiring. And you showed a lot of patience, because I know how annoying it is when people ask things that are inbuilt in your structure. And
I'm not a structured person. You should know.
But I think somebody wanted to ask questions or not, is it? Yeah, but this house has a mind of its own. no. So
I have
this-
one question, maybe I just
Yes.
saw that the
Thank you.
A heartfelt thank you for everything. Thank you so much. This was truly inspiring. So, Ali, you are having
Oh, that was.
your groupies on the screen and in the audience. No, it was amazing.
Thank you.
Can I ask, I just saw that there was the, I don't remember where it's sourced, but there was a claim that before we started hunting whales, there was a completely different uptake of carbon because the whales were much bigger and they were much older and therefore they had absorbed much more carbon, or I didn't really catch it. So now you're talking about zooplankton, but what is the deal with whales and this?
That's it. I mean, my face is like this because I'm trying to save PhD students. PhD is not my student just because she was asked to look at that problem for 2 years. So the argument is two ways. One is that there were so many of them that actually impacted what they ate and the primary productivity. I don't think that's correct. The second part of it is that the whales have to go to the surface to poop, and they poop very but they also feed in the deep ocean, so their poop is very rich in nutrients. It's actually called gold, liquid gold. No, why is it called liquid gold? It's not even liquid. It's anyway, but it's called gold. It's really rich in minerals. And so the argument is that if we had as many of them as we thought, and that they all did it at the surface, and that was a very efficient fertilizers for the surface ocean productivity. So that would be the leading order. And so this poor student for 2 years got all the data she could and did all the math. And the answer is.
But that's enough for a patient. If it doesn't matter and now you know it with some certainty, that's enough.
No, I think that facial expression was, we don't know.
No, I think there's not enough data I mean, there's not enough data on whale poop in the deep past, right? I don't think that.
So that's the responsibility of the PhD supervisor, not the student.
Which wasn't me.
Okay,
I'm just trying to get her to work on something very basic to get a chapter.
okay.
It was you, student.
In atmospheric modeling, we have the integrator.
I'm sorry for interrupting. A Greek student.
So you have to say him or her, because.
No, that's what I'm doing.
In atmospheric modeling, similarly to oceans, we have been building from dynamics, couple models, chemistry, and now biology is also entering, etc. You spoke about a lot of uncertainties. At least in atmospheric modeling, we have so-called adjoint models that quantify the uncertainties. Is it because of boundary conditions? Is it because of lack of in situ measurements, etc.? What is have you quantified the uncertainties? What are the top 5, let's say, uncertainties in your line of work?
Yeah, very good question. We have similar adjoint models. All what would be videos would be from such models that NASA has built called ECHO. And you rightfully pointed out that adjoint model is different from a reanalysis product, right? So we have that, and out of that you can do uncertainty quantification to see. So what are the uncertainties? I think basically the data in the deep ocean below 2,000 meters is not constrained, right? So it's really not constrained. So that's one. So any question that involves the time scales that need the below 2,000 meters, they just become very, very uncertain. But one of the key points, one of the most uncertain ones is turbulent mixing, because it's so fine scale and it's so intermittent that you really can't tune for that in those adjoint models. It's always enough that just you have to leave it free. But nevertheless, it's very important. And it becomes really much more important because turbulence, I talked about upwelling and circulation and turbulence, that can take decades to centuries, but the same turbulence in the upper ocean immediately can mix nutrients into the mixed layer, right? So almost immediately impacts the biology and productivity and carbon cycle. And so the models, climate models, adjoint models have been built by physicists, the same in atmospheric, right, by physicists. And then they add other tracers, not by biologists or biochemists. And as a result of that, all the parameters that go into the nutrient supply are turbulent mixing that is also used for the dynamics. And the priority has been to get the dynamics right and assume that the rest is okay. And as a result of that, turbulent mixing is one source of uncertainty. And to the extent that it impacts the productivity, I talked about air-sea carbon fluxes, you know, the linkages of very small scale dynamics and the upper ocean and the connection between biochemistry and chemistry and dynamics, that's really, we can't constrain the surface fluxes.
Vertical velocity is the same for the atmosphere. Nobody used to care about vertical velocity, but it affects a lot of things. A second question, have you taken advantage of the fact that there are only four entry points in the northern waters, you know, where the sea goes down? Do you use this in any way? Because we were very lucky, I suppose, instead of having hundreds of these sites, there are only four. Do you use this?
That's a very basic of physical oceanography. We use water parcels, we see what's the temperature, what's the salinity, nitrate, phosphate, oxygen, and then we do some form of classification, which now we are modernizing using machine learning to trace that. Okay, you can very easily trace that, oh, this water is now in Atlantic, but it came from Pacific, and along the way probably mixed with waters that came from Indonesian fruit flow or from the Southern Ocean. So that's the very basic thing that we do to map out the highways and water masses, and then do budgets and stuff. So.
Very much for this very interesting presentation. As a meteorologist, I have been concerned with the increased use of AI for data-driven predictions in contrast with equation-based predictions. We have a similar issue in oceanography.
I think we all have that problem, right? I mean, yes.
Because, for instance, you have the closure problem. You use Boussinesq approximations. You use Prandtl numbers for turbulence. You use Salomon approximations and so on. But it's still not enough.
No, I think there are very different ways. I think if you think about individual processes and how we parameterize them and use AI to do that, that's still you're functioning within the framework of modeling, right? You're just using AI to fine-tune things and plug them in.
But then, libraries.
Yeah, but then if you step back and say, can I actually do the whole thing? I have a collaborator at Imperial College that thinks that we should not worry about small-scale turbulence. Just force grid and just use stochastic forcing and AI to force the whole thing. And at that point, then it becomes really philosophical. And I've been in enough conversations over the past 5 years that I nag about something, and then the argument is that, but it works, right? And then you're like, well, it actually kind of works. So I think that's a broader conversation on the applied side, but also on the education side. Like one problem I have teaching-wise is that what is knowledge, right? I mean, if you use AI and create something very complex and use it to learn something about the system, to change the temperature and then the very new generation really think that that's knowledge, right? And it reminds me of the painting of "This is not a pipe," right? I have to say that this is not the pipe.
That's why it is a philosophical.
It is really philosophical, and I think, yeah, my worry about my career is that this is really moving rapidly. So every summer I spent a month trying to learn, and I think now I know, and then halfway in the academic year, I don't know what students are talking about anymore. It's a good thing, but
and we have the same questions in socioeconomics. I mean, in econometrics, it's always the same thing. Are you gonna let the data tell you? Is it gonna be a data-driven process, or are you going to try to retrieve the underlying distribution by, identifying the first moment, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth moment of the distribution, and then try to structurally describe the system? Or is it a combination of the two? What is it?
yeah, no, it is definitely an opportunity, but also a challenge. There are perspective articles on this in climate modeling that came out a couple of times, which is the emphasis on physics-based or equation-based. And the danger isn't that if you don't do that and just do the whole thing AI, that it's not gonna work. The danger is that very quickly we're gonna end up with something that's very complicated, and we just don't have the bandwidth and the resources to trace back what we're talking about. And we're just gonna lose grip on that. And that's really the real danger, which is also relevant to, again, all of this emphasizes data, right? The importance of observational programs, because that anchors you at least to something real.
But it relates back to this question, right? If you don't have enough data, shouldn't you try to go back and then have to make a more dynamical equation to describe?
Yeah, but
There you may still need some data, but less.
yeah, but I don't, I'm a. Yeah, I mean,
Complex maybe.
I know, but I still, I think our field, earth sciences in general, is still very much data driven. Like if it's not, we can't have frameworks that entirely come out of physics. Like fluid dynamics, like the base of everything in the atmosphere, ocean, motion, right? You can write down the equations of the flow purely on kinematics basics, like except for the term that's for friction. And there you have a coefficient for viscosity or diffusion. And that's entirely empirical and contextual. And that's where, without that, you can't solve the equation, right? That's where the energy goes out of the system. You force it, that's where you lose the energy, so you get equilibrium. And that's what's where the data is really needed. So, but I think
You have mixed systems, right?
Yeah. So I think we need I think what people are arguing is that we need a collective strategy on how much data, what source we need. Physical oceanography has been very grassroots, free range. People say we think there's turbulence there, get funding, go and measure stuff, and they try to understand it. I think we're at the stage of saying with new technology and AI, autonomous systems, new energy, marine tech, how can we design what data or what source we need that we can get the data that we need to constrain the models using AI? That's the conversation. Now, these are very expensive programs. How do you get them funded? You go to digital twins, maybe that's one way, but then the stakeholder would dictate what you measure and what you get. But then how do you keep the intellectual freedom and the academic freedom? So I think all of these are very.
And the stakeholder is so important because look what happened with utility and risk preferences. We need the fifth derivative to define the risk preferences of people. You go to the financiers, the insurance companies, and they say, this is crazy, come on guys. How on earth I'm going to have the data to estimate the function that would get me to the fifth derivative to give you the information that you need to create an insurance policy. So there is a limit to where there shouldn't be a limit, but there should be some practicality that is relevant for the stakeholder on that.
So from my perspective, like as a climate scientist in the earth science department, I mean, the reason I'm here and trying to make connections is that, like, if I look at my entire department, we're just not engaged in those conversations. We just do classic observations, get the data, understand the fundamental science. But I think if you really think that there are things that urgently need addressing, I think we really need to at least have conversations cross-discipline. And that should feed into education, tech development, commercialization. And how do you do it in a way that doesn't go with the political cycles of one government funding something and not? So anyway, so all the other risk informations, all the talks and all the proposals, I think that's very useful. And I think we need a class of academics that like to work in that interface. Not many, because I think it's very important for academics to be able to do what they want and dig deep and understand something fundamentally. I don't think we need to revolutionize the universities, but I think we were talking about this, at least in the UK. The UK government is funding projects that's geared towards creating a class of people that work at the interface. And at the same time, they're making sure that there are a large number of fellowships for early career scientists that gives them 5 to 8 years that they can do anything they like. So they can develop fundamental understanding, but then there's another set of funding but it's becoming, as a result of that, your early career, you can do fundamental work, but then when you get to my age, everything is really, really applied. If I want to study turbulence in the Southern Ocean, it's very difficult to not get it funded. But then we can get early career people and convince them to do it. Okay. Thanks a lot, everyone. One thing I forgot to say, everything I said about bipolar seesaw holds moving forward predictions. They're moving forward for different scenarios, what happens to circulation, what is thesis, so. And he uses a lot of data. They're interested in what that actually means in quantitative way for moving forward on centennial timescale. He would